All right, we'll get going in a little under 5 minutes.
Sounds good. The audio sound right when you're in?
Sure. Could I get just a couple seconds of sustained audio from you, Dan?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Dan Mason. I'm going to do a presentation today. How's the volume on this audio?
Sounds good. Sounds
about right?
Clear.
Okay. Perfect.
Good deal. We'll get going in about 3 minutes.
Okay. I will stand by.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's Agile Friday. I'm Justin Burns from the Office of the CIO. I'll be your host. And joining us today is Dan Mason from Septara. Dan will be talking to us about Lean meets Agile hybrid project methods. This will be a 1-hour event with 30 minutes presentation from Dan, followed by 30 minutes Q&A. Using the chat window, you can send questions to me, Justin Burns, at any time, and I'll forward them on to Dan after the presentation. Agile Fridays are a collaboration between the Office of the CIO and Results Washington. You can find out more and keep up to date at ocio.wa.gov/Agile-Fridays. A big thanks to Dan and Septara for helping us out today. With that said, I'll turn control over to Dan.
Okay. Thank you, Justin. Quick check. Everybody, can you hear me, Justin? I'm assuming I'm okay. Good. I will go ahead and get started. So title, Lean meets Agile, Hybrid Project Management Methods. And my slides to work here. There we go. So the obligatory who we are slide. Septara Corporation, founded in 2002. Mainly a group of black belts. It's a small company with broad industry experience, including government. We are certified for the Washington State Lean Pool of qualified vendors for state contracts. So feel free to call us up with some business. And below is the contact information. So check us out at septara.com or give us a call. As for myself, I've been around about 20 years in product development. My background is software and software management. I am certified Scrum Master, also a Lean Six Sigma Black Belt. I kind of like the combination of both things and try to get my hands on as many management tools as possible. Currently doing some consulting for a performance improvement project that happens to be over a large company in Redmond. I am a methodology geek. I'm fascinated by the puzzle of high-performance software teams, why they work, and how to get them that way. So I do explore every methodology option that pops up, as well as kind of OD approaches. So first thing I wanted to say is I took a look at the website of Agile Friday's website and looked back at some of the presentations that have been done so far. There's actually some very good ones. So, and actually some presentations that are really pretty much on the same subject. There's some excellent presenters that are well known in the community, and I would encourage you to, if you're interested in this subject, to go back and take a look at those. Most of them have their slides posted as well, so they're definitely worth checking out. Today, my approach is going to be to talk a little bit about the emergence of Lean Agile, contrast it with waterfall, the traditional kind of sequential approach. What I really want to focus on is the commonalities between Lean and Agile, some terminology clarification there, and talk about first principles. So really, what are the underlying reasons that Lean and Agile techniques actually work, and because of that, how you can actually do a little mix and matching of techniques that come from each methodology. I'm going to talk about why you might want to try Agile, Scrum in particular first, and why you might not, and how you can mix certain practices. And finally, I want to leave you with some reference materials, which are on the latter slides, and some books, essays for deeper exploration. We can only go so far in 30 minutes. So terminology-wise, Scrum and Agile are often used interchangeably. They're not really the same thing. Agile is an umbrella term that's based on the Agile Manifesto. Scrum is by far the most well-known and popular implementation of an Agile project management method, but it is not the only one, and they're not really the same. They're not synonyms. Similarly, Lean and Kanban are often used interchangeably, and they are not the same thing either. So software Kanban, in fact, is a specific Lean software technique. Lean and Kanban, on the whole, are also used in other disciplines besides software. Obviously, as you both most know, it arose from manufacturing, actually. But today, we will use Scrum as kind of the proxy to represent Agile, and the Kanban technique as the proxy for Lean software. So why is there such an interest in Lean Agile? Well, if you're like me, you've spent a lot of your career using variants of the waterfall method for a long time, very long time. And this would be a kind of a stage gate, any kind of stage gate process that has phases that hand off from one to another is typically, we can umbrella term that as waterfall. The management of software development has continued to undergo profound changes, and we're looking for that silver bullet that will be applicable to manage software projects successfully in any environment or any application. And we have not found that. It's why not? These difficulties, interestingly enough, have been recognized really since the beginning of true professional software development. And the writings of Fred Brooks, Tom DeMarco, and others, they recognized how difficult it is to manage way a long time ago. So, but no one-size-fits-all technique has been devised. And, you know, the kind of the amazing thing is we've known about how hard it is for a long time, but still have not found the one way. So we have several ways. So looking back, Fred Brooks, he's one of my heroes because he had just wonderful insights into software development a long time ago. One of my favorite observations of his is that even the best planning is not so omniscient as to get it right the first time. For many years, we've been trying to predict what will happen during a software project. We do big upfront plans and lay out our work breakdown and do our Gantt charts and our phasing and so forth, which I consider to be kind of a predictive approach. We predict what we're going to build, what it'll look like. We predict all the activities that we're going to do building it, how long these activities will take, and so forth. And frankly, this hasn't worked so well. Statistically speaking, these stats are a couple of years old, but as of a couple of years ago, only 20 or 30% of projects come in on plan. And all the other ones are some mix of killed completely, late, or didn't deliver the functionality. So what we've started to learn is that even if we had perfect knowledge today at the start of a software project, perfect knowledge of all the circumstances, all the resources, et cetera, and did a plan, that knowledge would be different tomorrow, and the plan would be different because context and circumstances change in multiple dimensions in software projects. The requirements constantly change. The programmers and their level of knowledge of the tools they're using, and also the application domain, the problem they're solving, changes every day, or often, I should say. And therefore, a plan that predicts the future is up against a pretty hard challenge, because the planning platform, if you will, the foundation, shifts based on the fact that so many things are changing around it. So that's one point that Fred made. Another one is this, which is kind of a grandiose statement, but it's very pertinent, and that is that the programmer works only slightly removed from pure thought, and software comes almost directly from someone's brain to a working system to a few keystrokes, and with a few keystrokes you can make large changes in an application. So this is awesomely flexible stuff, and that's what makes software so cool. But it adds an incredibly unpredictable factor to it. It's at the whim of a thought and a few finger movements, we can make big changes and either make things wonderful or screw them up by the same token. We're beginning to realize that the programmer and the programming team is itself a complex system, an adaptive system. And that's kind of a fancy term. There's a whole science around it. But basically what it means is that it's a learning system that is constantly adapting to new knowledge as it goes. So what the upshot of that is the more often you can recalibrate your plan and your direction based on the knowledge you have today rather than the knowledge you had yesterday, the more likely you are to constantly be on the right path or the optimal path. And that's really kind of the fundamental precept of lean and agile and any iterative approach. So what I'm going to get to here is that underneath lean and agile are some first principles. And these actually, by now, have actually been kind of demonstrated mathematically, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But at the time lean and agile were created, it's just because people observed that certain things work and codified them into manifesto and certain techniques. The main thing is that lean and agile are both examples of what you might call empirical process control. So with empirical process control, we seek constant, quick incorporation of new knowledge to inform the next steps that we take. So the process itself is guided by the reality you encounter along the way. This means that, in effect, you're constantly doing your plan over and over again based on today's reality. If you look at it from a macro kind of perspective, this is rooted or similar to the bending cycle of quality, the plan, do, study, act, which is constantly trying things, recalibrating based on observed results. So if we apply that in the context of software, we end up with an iterative approach, which could be called Agile and Lean. And I want to juxtaposition that to predictive process control, sometimes known as waterfall, where you make a prediction, and then really the game comes to be bending reality to make the prediction come true by juggling resources, redefining success, and generally driving the plan becomes the thing you're working to. And sometimes it's easy to miss really the desired outcome. It all becomes about hitting the milestone, and a milestone that was predicted 2 or 3 or 6 months ago, when a lot of people on the team may think that this was the wrong goal in the first place, based on knowledge that we now have that we didn't have when we started. So to incorporate reality, Lean and Agile, they emphasize delivery of small increments of software frequently. So Kanban is a methodology within Lean that emphasizes, like manufacturing, the one-piece flow, reduction of cycle time by eliminating wasteful activities. Agile does this by focusing on delivery of new working code in a time-boxed sprint that is from 2 to 4 weeks generally. So again, the idea is spend a couple of weeks, a short amount of time delivering some code, and then replan. So then, incorporate reality, incorporate information that you've learned. And both approaches ensure that new learning can be constantly applied to your project and to your planning process. Now, limiting the amount of work in progress is something that both methods do. Scrum, they do it differently. Scrum uses sprints, time boxes, and backlogs. So I'm assuming, by the way, that there's some knowledge of Agile, some knowledge of Scrum in the audience here today, but there may be varying amounts. Hopefully, in the end, the bottom line, it won't matter how much you know. But if some of it seems too complex or too simple, that's kind of due to the way I put this together for a general audience. In any case, Scrum accomplishes the limitation of work by pulling a set of features or stories from a backlog and basically locking the door on the room and working on that set of stuff for a specific amount of time, which we call a time box. So you, by definition, choose the amount of work you're going to do, limit it. In a idealized Scrum world, you don't let other work come in the door, and you don't allow anybody to disturb what you're doing. In the real world, that's pretty hard to do, but some groups are pretty good at it. In Kanban, you actually map out the process steps that you're undertaking to get software done, and you explicitly set work in process limits on each process step. And the point of that is to avoid building up queues of work or backlogs of work, if you will. Queues is a better word in this case. In front of process steps, you want work to flow from one step to another without being constrained or running into bottlenecks. You do this by setting explicit width limits, and those width limits or you test them over time and figure out what limits make your process work the best. Another thing is a high degree of collaboration and communication are fundamental and foundational in both Scrum and Kanban. Scrum kind of encourages that and forces it to happen by having self-organizing teams with few roles involved that operate with a prescribed set of meetings in which you do certain things. And in particular, the daily stand-up is a meeting where the whole team gets together face-to-face and has high bandwidth communication. The structure of Scrum by the book kind of forces the team to learn how to communicate and collaborate. Whereas Kanban has no prescribed roles, and it's more of a Kaizen approach. Now, Kaizen is a term you may be familiar with. Essentially, that's a continuous improvement term where you have a group of people with a common task in front of them, and they swarm together to solve problems. And that's one of the Kanban model. But in either case, both these methods rely heavily on face-to-face communication rather than document handoffs. And they kind of discourage someone taking a spec and going off in the corner and coding for a couple of months and coming back. So for organizations where that has been the norm, this is a rather eye-opening change when they go to a lean or agile approach. Finally, on the first principles, both methods look at a pull kind of mechanism to get work into the system. Work is not dumped into the system in a big batch. It's pulled into the system as there is room and capacity to get more work done. So like a picture of wet noodle going through a tube, pushing is not going to get it there, but if you can pull it through, it'll flow smoothly, to have a funky metaphor there. If you attempt to push it, it simply backs up, and queues of work are very bad. That's been shown mathematically and through operational research. In the case of Agile Scrum, you pull work from a backlog of work. You pull a set of work for each sprint, and you go do that work, and that's limited, and it's pulled, and when you're done, you go back and pull more work. Lean Kanban, in contrast, also pulls from the queue of work, but it's on demand. So whenever there's capacity available, if someone frees up from doing one set of work or one work item, they can immediately go pull another thing off the queue. There's no set time when a bunch of stuff is pulled from the queue. Once a team is up and running in Kanban mode, anybody can pull work off the queue, and the queue is typically prioritized such that the thing at the top of the queue is logically the most important thing to do next. However, there's certainly some smarts to be applied to common sense, pull the right thing. The main point is the difference in pulling a set of work and going and working on it versus just pulling stuff on demand whenever you've got the capacity to do it. So, given those principles, what's better, lean or agile? Well, both. Both are better than predictive methods in many circumstances. There are some exceptions. And they're more similar to each other than they're different, especially relative to the waterfall sequential method. Lean and agile are, compared to that, they're almost the same. But there is a lot of religion in the so-called methodologist community and the folks that think about this stuff a lot and go and practice it and come up with methods. They're some people really believe, for example, that you must adhere strictly to the Scrum guide and enact all the rules and have exactly all the meetings at the times and so forth. Others think that it really doesn't need to be as prescriptive as others would think. Lean in general is a less prescriptive approach, and I'll talk about why in a second. What works, though, I believe, is largely dependent on the culture of the organization, the history that breeds the culture, the personalities of individuals, but collectively the personality of the team, the maturity of the existing capability, and maturity of the people, frankly, also, the type of work you're doing, the size of the project. In other words, context really drives what works best in any particular situation. In my experience, Scrum can be a good starting point for the following reasons. Scrum is more rigid about rules, rituals, and artifacts than Lean Kanban is. This can be useful if you need to introduce some habits or break some old ways that you want to kind of get away from. Scrum, by definition, demands a high degree of collaboration and communication. This is encouraged by prescribed meetings like stand-ups. There's a really total focus on delivering a limited set of functionality in a short time frame. So people can be encouraged to break the habits of multitasking and break the habits of taking on the work that might be distracting from the core work they're trying to focus on. So, one of the magic tricks of Scrum is, by virtue of having a 2-week or to 4-week window to get stuff done in, you think about it every day that, wow, I've got 10 days left, wow, I've got 8 days left. Whereas on somebody hands you a 6-month schedule, it's just psychologically seems a lot less urgent, even though you may need to work really hard to make that 6-month schedule. Psychologically, you've got 6 months till the end. Scrum emphasizes visual controls, so there's a thing called a Scrum board. It's typically the process flow is outlined, and then sticky notes are used to show where work is in the process. And this stays in a highly visible location in the building, so anyone can come and look at it, and that turns out to be very effective for keeping everyone on the same page. That's a great communication device. Scrum typically utilizes metrics in the form of burn down charts and velocity. These are burn down chart just shows where you are relative to what you have taken on for a particular sprint. That is, that set of work you've chosen to do, where are you in the process of getting that done? And that can show you how likely you are to get that done by the end of the sprint. At the end of the sprint, and this is another thing that Scrum is good at kind of embedding in your brain, is that you will do a new plan at the end of every sprint. So you get to reset your knowledge base, if you will. You've learned stuff during that sprint. You are now a different person from a knowledge point of view. You know more about the requirements. You know more about the domain. You know more about the technical approach and what works and what doesn't. So getting used to this replanning cycle every few weeks is a really positive thing to get you out of the kind of long-term thinking mode. So, but Scrum, it does have its downsides, and one being it can be a very dramatic cultural change for staff because of these tightly prescribed rules and rituals, which may be way different from the way you work today. And frankly, some groups will have trouble with this. Some groups will not, depending on, as I said earlier, the personalities involved and the culture of the team. Scrum tends to optimize, if you read the Scrum Guide or Agile Project Management using Scrum, you'll notice that it's all about the development team. And reading these books and articles, and you would assume that there is no other part of the company involved in around development. There's something called a customer out there somewhere, but there aren't other departments that you might have to deal with, documentation, professional services, support, etc., aren't really addressed in the core Scrum process. So this can be an issue. It can cause the dev team to kind of feel like they have the right to isolate themselves and not talk to anybody. And we know in the real world that doesn't work. The structure of Scrum, another kind of challenge of Scrum, is that the sweet spot for Scrum team-wise is 5 to 7 people. You can go bigger than that, and I have, but it starts to get unwieldy pretty quick. And it doesn't scale well to really big projects with really big teams. There are mechanisms for doing that, breaking the project up into parts and then doing Scrum of Scrums where the Scrum Masters all get together and do a Scrum that covers the entire project. But that's, in my view, has met with limited success. So it's great in some contexts, not so great in others. And the last thing is that because of the sprint structure and the fact that you have time boxes, that means you have deadlines. And if you come from a world of waterfall that may have milestones or phase gates or deadlines, it can be easy to slip into the same kind of bad habits or bad practices that arise from the waterfall approach, and that is sandbagging on your estimates, cutting corners to meet the dates, saying you're done, but you've built up some technical debt. So the whole aspect of having stake in the ground and commitments around sprints leads to kind of little mini waterfalls, and that's not what we're looking for. So on the other hand, lean Kanban can be made to start more gradually and implemented into an organization, starting with your current process and making incremental changes from there. That steps being first understanding how it is you work today without changing it. You don't want to change anything. You go figure out, hey, here's the steps that we really take. And looking at it objectively and saying, do we really need to do this step? Do we need to really write that document? Do we really need this approval? And so forth. That's kind of a first pass. But you want to make all your work states and all the work in those states transparent and visible. So you really know what you have on the plate, and not only on the plate, but where it is on the plate. And then at that point, you can start thinking about constraints and bottlenecks, et cetera, and why is, and in front of this step, we have a build-up of finished work that's ready to go to that next step. You may want to look at that step and see if it needs to be unconstrained in some way. Or you might want to look upstream and see if you can slow down that process, use some of those resources somewhere else. And the focus in Kanban is to measure cycle time to finish a feature or the functionality, and then improve upon that cycle time using incremental process improvements. So a little bit gentler to get a lean Kanban methodology going. But again, the Scrum, the kind of shock and treatment of doing Scrum for a few months really opens up people's minds to have what changes they may need in their mindset. So that being said, hybridizing methods. Here's some examples of taking formal Scrum, representing Agile in this case, and changing it based on what makes sense. So one of the constant arguments about Scrum is the stand-up meeting, the daily stand-up. And is it, do you really need one every day? Does good information get passed there among team members, et cetera? If done correctly and everyone's on board and enthusiastic about using this mechanism, it can be very effective. Sometimes, however, on projects, you just don't have that much information to exchange. This is a context-specific thing, really. And so some teams develop a different cadence. So they don't meet every day for a stand-up. They meet twice a week, every other day, whatever makes sense. They try that. If that works, they use it. If not, they try something else. Another big area where methods can be kind of blended is in the area of time boxing. So Scrum has a very definite requirement for time boxing of sprints. Kanban, on the other hand, does not. And Kanban, basically, it's a continual flow process where you're pulling stuff off the queue to work on and optimizing how fast that gets done and how well that gets done, but you don't have little mini projects along the way. So some teams can use they want to use a Kanban approach, but they like the cadences that you get from planning meetings, like sprint planning meetings, sprint retrospectives, demos, et cetera. So overlay those rituals, if you will, on top of a more Kanban approach, which may not have time boxing, but still has the rhythm of the business with the meetings. And typically those would be a continuous delivery kind of organization that puts a lot of new releases up on production, or at least up in test on a regular basis. The burn down chart, it's an artifact that is usually prescribed for Scrum. Well, you don't really have to use that. You could use a cumulative flow diagram, which is typically more of a lean tool. Do you need to strictly work off a priority queue, or can you work on a first in, first out basis? That's a decision that can be made locally, just seeing what's the most effective. So it's a kind of a process of trying things, figuring out what works, and using it, regardless of whether you're being pure to one method or another. So Scrum generally tries to break down work into like-sized chunks so that you can measure how many chunks go into a sprint, and you can measure how many chunks get done per sprint. That's okay, and velocity is not absolutely necessary if you can estimate cycle time, which is more of a lean approach, and that is, if you can estimate how long it takes to get a thing of a certain size done, that gives you effectively the same kind of information that velocity does, without having to break things down into approximately equal chunks of work. In the Scrum world, teams are asked to commit to a certain amount of deliverables in the sprint. So at the planning meeting, everyone stands up and salutes, yes, this is the list, this is what we're going to do, and we're committed to getting it done. I believe a commitment is a wonderful thing. However, once you're committed, you feel obligated, is another word for it, to meet those goals, and you feel bad if you don't meet your commitments, even if there's good reason for that, because as we already know, estimation is a difficult and error-prone thing. So what can happen in this is that if you're committed to it, it may lead you to fudge things, and leads you to believe you're done, when in the back of your mind you know there's maybe a few things you probably could have done differently. So some flexibility in sprint deliverables. You can still stick with sprints, you can still stick with time boxes, but you might have a little more flexibility in the deliverable delivery. In other words, you're committing to trying to get a set of stuff done, but you're recognizing that at the end of the sprint, there may be some things that aren't completely done, and you don't have to feel really bad about that or shoot anybody, because that's just the way life is. But you've got a mechanism to deal with it. You roll it over into the next sprint or whatever your process may be. So in the end, what matters is the team that's operating at its maximum sustainable pace. So without getting into a death march, without working crazy hours, but having still a continuously high level of productivity, that's the goal of all this stuff. And whatever way you can get that done is perfectly wonderful, at least in my view. So in summary, Lean, Kanban, Agile, Scrum are manifestations of similar principles. The first principles we talked about. Both are rooted in empiricism rather than command and control and prediction. As long as the first principles are met, a mix of techniques can be borrowed from each method, I believe. And I think you should experiment. Drop things that don't work for you, for your context, and try new things that might. So here's a list for your future perusal of texts that I think are worthy to take a look at if you're interested in the subject. Agile Project Management with Scrum, that's kind of the fundamental Scrum book. Various Agile books by any of these authors, Mike Carrington, Beck, Martin Collier, Jim Highsmith, they've all written seminal books about Scrum, different aspects of Scrum, from testing to requirements. So any of those are wonderful. There's a book called Kanban, which is the kind of the original Lean Kanban seminal book, written by a guy named David Anderson. He's from Seattle. It was developed through his work at Microsoft and Corbis, which are local companies. And since then has grown kind of virally worldwide and has a lot of adherence. What you find in book number 1, Agile Project Management Scrum, and the book Kanban, is they both, if you read them, you'll believe, they would lead you to believe those are the only possible ways to do anything. So what I'm representing in my talk today is that's not true. You can actually do a mix of things that make sense. A really good Lean Project Management book series is by Mary and Tom Poppendick. The first one I think is the best, which is Lean Project Management and Agile Toolkit, which takes a very, very pragmatic and practical view of how to use Lean in the context of software. There's some specific books and articles on combining Scrum and Kanban. The one by Henrik Nyberg is very good. It has cartoons, you gotta love that. It's got examples. And it's an excellent distillation of the Scrum and Kanban to the principles, which we talked about earlier. There's an essay by Corey Lattice, another local guy, called Scrumban, that essentially defined a new methodology. Some people think it's heresy. Others, like myself, think it's pretty cool because it tries to use the best parts of each method. And lastly, if you're really a geek and you really want to understand why small batches work better than large batches, and short iterations work better than long ones. Read this book. It'll take you a while, and you may have to read it more than once. There's some math involved, but there's some excellent concepts in there, such as cost of delay, weighted shortest job burst, and other kind of geeky metrics that at the end of the day tend to prove that iterative development is wonderful, flow is wonderful, and Donald Reinerson proves that through queuing theory and other mathematical mechanisms. Okay, so that's all I've got. Let's open it up for questions. Justin, you're on.
I am. All right. Thanks a bunch, Dan. Thanks, everybody. That concludes today's presentation portion. We're moving on to the Q&A portion. We've got about little bit shy of 20 minutes for Q&A. Using the chat window, you can send questions to me, Justin Burns, or you can send them publicly if you prefer. And we will give it a minute for some questions to go into the queue, but I've got about 1 million for you, Dan. So this is an area that I'm super fascinated by too. I will probably be checking out the Principles of Product Development Flow book because I'm that kind of geek. But cool. I've read Scrumban, and I've just really been interested in that. So I've got a few questions kind of all over the map here for you. I'll hit you with a couple of them. One thing you mentioned when you're talking about kind of mix and match rules, you talked about doing a stand-up or a Scrum less often. I've always viewed that as more of an indicator, a sign that maybe you're not on the same product stream. If when I've been working on the same software product with people, a daily Scrum is invaluable. I wouldn't give it up for anything in the world. Other times I'm scrumming with people that are all doing different things in different areas, and it feels like too much then. But rather than just reduce the frequency of it, does that serve as an indicator that maybe there's some deeper problem that you should be looking at?
Possibly. It could be. I think you have to look at that closely. It could be a problem of people not wanting to participate and just being skeptical in general. It can also be, as you point out, a situation where people aren't, even though it's the same general program, they may not be working closely in the same areas of code, may not have a lot of interest in what the other guy is working on, and it may not be as valuable to them as a situation where they're working in the same area trying to deliver something together that requires a lot of coordination. That's certainly the case. And the Scrum Master is, of course, his charter is to enforce or kind of take care of the process itself. Scrum Master is not supposed to tell you what to do and enforce any behavior in stand-ups except the regular, what did I do today, what am I going to do tomorrow, or what did I do yesterday, what I'm going to do today, what are my issues. So someone in there, but the Scrum Master is usually the person that has to sniff around and say, there's something wrong here. And it's not the fact that we're meeting every day. And I think the team itself needs to come up with that determination of, hey, and it can change where you are in the project too. You can say, hey, right now everybody's kind of heads down. Let's meet Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And but there are some people, like perhaps yourself, that religiously want to adhere to the stand-up, and that's okay. That's okay too. My point would be that it can still be effective. Maybe your point is not as effective. I don't know.
All right, great. Well, thank you. I know that was kind of a mini pronged question there. So we have a question from Curtis in the audience. Curtis says, I've been reading about how Agile and Scrum may not be the right approach to systems of record, which is a term that we deal with a lot in the state, and or more complex software systems. What's your take on this?
Well, I think some parts of Scrum are pretty applicable anywhere. The parts of where it gets maybe a little dicey is Scrum wants to be documentation light. It wants to depend on a lot of face-to-face, voice-to-voice communication. Doesn't leave behind a ton of artifacts in terms of design documents, although it can. But those aren't emphasized as much as kind of the real-time communication. So if you're in a business like medical equipment, aerospace, anything that's kind of mission critical, or system of record where data is where you have to be extremely careful, you may have Sarbanes-Oxley requirements that you have to deal with. Those become just part of the project requirements, and you have to do them. Can you do them with Scrum? I think so, but a lot of people used to think Scrum was only good for doing UIs, right, for doing GUIs. And it turns out, wow, hey, we can really use this to do back-end stuff as well. It's a little different approach, but we can still use Scrum. So once you take a situation where you have a required set of documentation, say you're doing medical device software and you have FDA requirements on traceability, then Scrum becomes more and more un-Agile-like, and there's nothing you can do about it because these deliverables are what they are, and you have to deliver them. But in terms of complexity, I disagree that Scrum can't deal with complexity. In fact, sometimes it's the best because you get rich collaboration, you get lots of eyes on a problem. And, in the ideal world, the way it's supposed to work, you get a lot of eyes on the problem to solve it. And certainly there's some things where one person needs to go off and figure it out. And algorithm design may be one of them, et cetera. There's no blanket statement that you can make, I think, about how to, whether or not you can apply Scrum to a problem of complexity. That's my opinion.
Right. It seems like no matter how you approach that problem, it's going to require a certain amount of engineering discipline. And in the case of Scrum, it seems like it would require a pretty strong, competent product owner too to kind of keep people steered towards that narrow path when it's so easy to get all over the place.
Absolutely.
So,
I mean, that's a good point. You always have to have strong product management. People will wander off and into the weeds, even though they're self-organizing and they're accountable. It does help to have someone who's kind of keeping track of focus.
All right. So Curtis likes your answer. I think he's got a follow-up question here. With respect to complex, he says, I am more concerned with the testing done within a sprint and the more complex integration testing for big systems.
Right. Okay. Well, in the ideal Scrum team, you have testers that are pretty code savvy, and they're up there next to the engineers, and that may be even helping with unit tests. And you're kind of doing a code test cycle along the way. Now, as I mentioned, and you might be using something like extreme programming, which has pair programming. You could put some testers in there. But as I mentioned earlier, team size and project size does impact the effectiveness of Scrum itself. If you have very large projects with big teams, it quickly starts getting unwieldy just due to the number of informal communication paths that have to take place. You add one person to a 10-person team, you've got a lot more paths already. So as things get bigger, the utility of having reference documents like architecture documents and design documents and so forth, the utility of those things gets a lot higher, and you may be, best served to go ahead and do some of those, even though documentation is not something that's heavily emphasized in Scrum.
Got it. All right. Next question. So is it your perception that pure Scrum is essentially training wheels for doing pragmatic Agile? Will accomplished teams tend towards a hybrid approach, or is that something that has to be a conscious decision by the team we're going to do hybrid Agile lean?
I think it, and I could get a lot of grief for this subject, but yeah, I do think that there's utility in doing some period of time of pretty strict Scrum, and getting used to the rituals, getting used to talking to people every day, etc. But then process improvement should always be a part of your operation. So you start with Scrum by the book and then improve it from there. An interesting thing about the Agile Manifesto itself is, it's communications over processes and tools. Well, Scrum is a process. So, Scrum counts as one of those things that is good to have, but is overridden by the need to be as effective as possible. And some Scrum evangelists, I think, lose track of the fact that they're arguing against their own principle in a way.
It's a very Zen sentiment there. Scrum is a process that, says have no process.
Exactly.
So we got a few minutes left. I want to get this one in while we still have time, and that would be, what is your favorite mix? If you could take one or the other and add one rule from the other side of the table, what would you do? How would you mix that up? Just your personal favorite. I realize that there's no one right answer here.
Yeah, I get it. I prefer a Kanban kind of approach, more of a lean approach, where you're trying to get to the point that you've got perfect flow through a system, and everybody's working at the highest efficiency possible, and you don't have overhead of certain rituals, etc. so often. But I have to say, I like the stand-up meetings. Possibly not every day, possibly every day. I think there's a value there. Not everybody believes that, but I think having some kind of informal meeting, developers only, tech talk only, we did this, we're going to do this, here's what's in my way. And that probably the most important part of that is here's my blockage discussion, because at that point you can say, Jim, Sue, can we get together at 10 o'clock and I can show you my problem, we can fix it. Because you have that brief stand-up thing, you really figure out where people are, and you can quickly swarm to remove blockages. Whereas if you don't have that communication, people might work in a vacuum for a longer period of time without asking for help. Yeah.
Okay.
So Kanban with some stand-ups.
Gotcha. If it were me, it would be Scrum with work and process limits. That seems like as close to a universal good as any sort of single practice that I've adopted recently.
Yeah.
I would tend to get myself overworked within the context of a sprint, and work in progress limits were a life changer for me.
That's an excellent point. Yep.
All right.
Okay.
Got a few more minutes. Don't have anything in the queue here, so if you had anything else you wanted to share with everybody before we go, feel free. Otherwise, I can wrap it up here and let people know what's coming up.
Nope, I'm good. I think I've said my piece, and really would encourage folks to look at those. Not only the previous webinars that people have done, which I think is some excellent material, but also check out some of those reference talks that are included in the slides, which will be available.
Absolutely, yep. And I was actually gonna mention that. Yes, we will have the video and the slides available by Monday. So thank you everybody for your great questions. Next week we're going to have Jean Richardson from AzureGate joining us. She's joined us once before. I don't have the topic of her presentation yet, but I will be posting it to our site, ocio.wa.gov/agile-fridays, as soon as I get it. You can go there anytime to find out more about what's coming up. So big thanks to Dan and Tara, and also Results Washington for helping to make Agile Fridays a success. Thanks everybody for joining us. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.
Great.
Thanks a bunch, Dan.
Thanks, Jose.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Bye now.